Dishonored, the Corroded Man, by Adam Christopher. Read to you today by Colby Akon. Prologue. Somewhere near Utrica, month undetermined, 1849 through 1850. Contrast this with the prisons of Tivia, located in the tundra at the center of that nation-state. At some of the labor camps in Tivia, there are literally no walls. A prisoner exhausted from hard labor and without tools is unlikely to survive the harsh climate, or the hungry packs of hounds that rove the frozen wastes. In fact, Tivian prison authorities make it known that any prisoner is free to leave at any time. In all of recorded history, no one has made the remote walk across the snow and ice to the nearest city. Prisons of the Isles. Extract from a report commissioned by the Royal Spymaster. The prisoner stopped at the edge of the precipice and gazed out over the land ahead, the trailing edge of his heavy black woolen gray coat flapping in the stiff wind that screamed out of the glacier valley in front of him. The gale was so loud he could barely think, let alone contemplate the complexity of the task ahead. There was no time to dally, no time to waste. There was work to be done. He had come this far, too far to fail, too far to give up, but at the same time, not far enough. Too close to his captors, to his tormentors. He knew he had to keep going. He knew that there was nobody in the world who could stop him except himself. The prisoner adjusted his black traveler's hat, pulling the wide brim down over his face to stop it cartwheeling away in the wind, and he looked out at what lay before him. This was the howling wind and the snowy wastes and the cold sun that burned with a flat dead light. This was the tundra. This was Tivia. The prisoner turned, letting the chains he carried over one shoulder slip off into the snow. At the other end of the chains was a bundle of black cloth curled into itself, shaking in the snow. If the shivering thing was whimpering or crying or begging for forgiveness, the prisoner couldn't hear it over the wind. This thing had once been a guard at Utrica, the labor camp. Now, the prisoner's own captive, he was numb. Numb from the cold, numb from the journey, numb from the knowledge that his story was coming to an end, and that soon he would be one with the void. Because the guard had not been a good man, and he knew it, he knew also the fate that would befall his untethered self once the prisoner had finished his cruel business in the hard snows. His end would come soon, but not yet. The prisoner still had need for him. He hefted the chains in his gloved hand, twisting, pulling just a little. The shivering wreck rose to his knees, but no further, and shuffled forward, but remained bowed, his head buried in a dozen orbits of his scarf, the huge collar of his black-gray coat upturned. It was the same kind the prisoner wore, the standard issue for the Tivian military designed for unpopular tours in the harsh, ice-bound interior of the country. The prisoner had taken his coat from another guard at the camp, one of 3 captives, and the first to die there in the camp before they had even walked out onto the snowy plain. The second had died 2 days into the trek, and the prisoner still had that captive's chain bound around his waist, the thick steel collar now hanging from his belt. The prisoner had needed 3 men, so he had taken 3. The first for his clothes, the heavy winter uniform of the Tivian army supplementing the ragged wardrobe the prisoner had worn for years and years without ever taking off. Now he wore the fur-lined greatcoat, the hat with the wide brim to shade from the glare of the dead winter sun, the scarf woven from the pelt of the tundra's saber-toothed black bear, and over his eyes the first guard's snow goggles. 2 discs of polished red glass nearly as big as the saucers of which the guards at the camp sipped their hot, imported Gristol tea. The first guard was dead. It had been a necessity. He hadn't wanted to surrender his uniform, so the prisoner had taken it by force. It was of no consequence. There was no one else alive at the camp for the man to guard. Not anymore. As the prisoner had picked over the dead guard's clothing, the other two he had captured, chained at the neck, shackled like the pigs they were, had knelt on the hard ground and watched in silence, their minds spinning over distant horizons as their new master got dressed for the long journey ahead. Then the prisoner had yanked at the chains and led his two captives away, their heads bowed, their lips moving as they murmured deliriously, stumbling through the snow behind him. The second guard had been taken for another purpose altogether. Food. Not food for the prisoner, nor for the third captive, but for the wolves the prisoner knew would be tracking them as soon as they left the safety and light of the camp's outer perimeter. After crossing that boundary, they had walked for 2 days through the snow that was sometimes hard-packed, other times waist-deep. The going was slow. The wolves were fast. In the hard winter, in the months of darkness, of high cold, of ice, this was their world, their domain. And outside of the Tivian prisons that dotted the frozen plains, man was a trespasser, though, for wildlife, not an unwelcome one. On the contrary, those trying to escape, the fools who thought they could make it, who took the mocking invitations of the guards to just walk out, were the most welcome indeed. Food was scarce, and in this frozen world the wolf packs were hungry. In the trek from the camp, the prisoner found evidence aplenty of previous flights of freedom. Such dreams, such attempts were all the same, ill-conceived, desperate, impossible. Because the prisons of Tivia were all the same, each was a labor camp in the wilderness, in the tundra. They varied in size, ranging from small camps of a few dozen convicts to prisons that were more like small towns. They varied in function, too. Those convicted of lesser offenses were doomed to nothing more than the harvest of lumber, still a task that would break most men, for the wood of the forests was as solid as Dunwall granite. The trees themselves were petrified by the cold, becoming nothing but tall vertical shafts of permafrost. But the lumber camps were not penitentiaries, not in the mind of the prisoner. They were something far lesser, merely correctional facilities, the inhabitants of which might even one day return to the warmth of civilization, albeit as shadows, as ghosts of their former selves, their fight, their rebellion, worked out of them. The other prisons were different, quarries for rock-breaking, or, as at Utreka, mines sunk deep into the tundra, where salt was wrested from an impenetrable frozen darkness in the earth. To be sentenced to those camps was to disappear. Death would be preferable, but there was no such statute in the Tivian law books. Indeed, to be sent to prison wasn't even considered a punishment, according to the twisted logic of the high judges, the quasi-military tribunal who ruled over the Isles with an iron fist. To be sent to the camps was, in their words, to be granted freedom, because the prisons had no walls. They had guards, certainly. The prisoner pitied the poor bastards who were themselves sentenced to long hours out in the frozen wastes. But at least the guards could go home again when their time was up. The guards were there to run the camps, to keep order, to keep the work going, to punish those who did not fulfill their quotas, whether it was lumber or salt or broken rock. But they were not there to prevent escape. Escape, the high judges said, was impossible, because the camps were not prisons. There were no walls, no gates, no fences. The prisoners were not shackled or manacled or locked in, at night or in the day. In fact, the prisoners were free to leave. Everyone in the camp was a free man, pardoned by the state, permitted with full authority to return home to their families and their towns and their villages and their causes. Of course, escape was impossible. The prisoners knew it, the guards knew it, the high judges knew it, but their hands were clean. their consciences clear, because every man was a free man. The prisoner and his 2 remaining captives came across the first body just a mile from the lights of the camp. Half of it was missing. It lay face down in the snow, arms outreached, the thin cloth covering the back torn wide open, exposing the perfect, unmarked flesh, as white as Morley alabaster and just as hard, frozen forever. What had become of the lower half of the man could not be known. This close to the camp, the would-be escapee would have died from the cold rather than been killed by wolves. Although, if the winter had been particularly bad, it was possible his legs had been taken by a desperate animal venturing closer to human habitation than it would normally risk. Probably scared off by the lights and the guards before it could do more than gnaw off the lower limbs. The cold had preserved the rest of the body perfectly. He could have been lying there a day, he could have been lying there 50 winters. The body was just the first, indeed. It was said that from the top of Utrika's north tower, on a clear day, you could see frozen cadavers lying even closer to the camp than this one. But the prisoner had never climbed the north tower to see. Now there wasn't a tower to climb. Not any more. Soon after, they had found a second body, then a third, then more. For a time, the prisoner and his 2 chained companions followed a virtual trail of corpses, each as cold as the ice, each looking as though the walker had just lain down for a while in the snow and had not gotten back up again. Some were intact, others were just parts. At the end of the second day, the prisoner slaughtered the second captive and butchered the body with a knife that had a golden hilt and a wicked double blade. As he did so, the last surviving captive sat in the snow at the end of his chain and watched with glazed eyes. Such was the magic that held him. The prisoner laid out the red meat and the wet bones for the wolves. It didn't look like much, spread out on the snow stained crimson under the cold sun, and the bones were a waste, but it would be enough. Free from the threat of wolves, he and his last captive would have time to reach the glacier valley, to reach his escape. The prisoner had examined the first 3 frozen bodies, just to be sure in his own mind that they weren't suitable. While he had expected to find the frozen cadavers, he hadn't expected that any of them would fit his needs. His examinations confirmed this. The flesh was hard, though pliable under his twin-bladed knife, but the bones beneath were unusable, the matrix of ice crystals within disrupting any reservoirs of power they may have once held. Useless. What he needed was the bones of a man. Living bones from a living man. To escape the tundra, to return to his world, he required a very particular sort of magic. This was why he had brought the 3rd captive. The 2nd had been brought for his flesh. The 3rd had been brought for his bones. The prisoner looked out at the glacier valley before him. The precipice on which he stood was a sheer drop of 1,000 feet or more. The cliff face was a shocking black scar of bedrock, and what had been, so far, an uninterrupted wasteland of blinding white. Ground and sky alike, the horizon merely a dirty gray smudge that flickered and moved in the corners of his eyes. Beyond the precipice was a deep, wide valley, the floor hard-packed snow, the walls a jagged jigsaw of giant blocks of ice, their sides vertical and deep. Translucent blue, as if the glacial crags were made of not ice but sapphire. It was, some said, one of the wonders of the world, a landscape of untold beauty. The ice field had been explored and illustrated for hundreds of years, but even the engravings that could be found within the precise geographical tombs housed at the Academy of Natural Philosophy in Dunwall could never do justice to the sheer, breathtaking majesty of the landscape. The landscape that was the key. His fur scarf pulled high, the wind tugging at the wide brim of his hat, the prisoner turned his red-glassed eyes from the valley to his last captive, bundled behind him in the snow. The wreck of a man lifted his head. Maybe he could sense that the moment was now, even as his addled mind swam in a sea of confusion, of madness. Another effect of the prisoner's magic, the magic that allowed him to walk out of the camp, and would allow him to walk out of the tundra, walk back to the world, to civilization, to revenge. As the last captive stared at his own reflection in his master's snow goggles, he moved his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Kneeling in the snow, the captive, the former camp guard, swayed from side to side as if held in thrall of his own distorted image. But his eyes were unfocused, his pupils small, the bare skin of his face worn red raw by the cold and by the wind that screamed and howled and screamed again. Behind his scarf the prisoner smiled. The magic, the aura, was holding. His escape was near. With his free hand, the one not wrapped in the end of the chain leash, he reached across his body, sliding his gloved hand beneath the heavy flap of his greatcoat. Even before he touched the knife, he could feel the warmth radiating from the twin blades. Indeed, he thought, perhaps the greatcoat, the hat, the scarf, perhaps he hadn't needed to kill that guard just to take his clothes. No matter, and besides, he had enjoyed the first guard's death. There was a satisfaction there, a small one, but a satisfaction nonetheless. Perhaps because it was the first tiny sliver of revenge, the first act of war against his oppressors, the first death of many more to come. The prisoner pulled the knife from his belt, and immediately the swooning captive's eyes found the blades and focused keenly on them, watching as they shone with a golden light. Taking the cold light of the sun and spitting it back is something else entirely, an electricity that sparked behind the eyelids, a reflection of a fire, of a great burning that ended one world and started another uncountable years ago. The knife was warm in the prisoner's hand, and that warmth spread up his arm through his body. It felt as if he was sinking into one of those rare natural volcanic hot springs that periodically interrupted the tundra, the springs that provided the camps with their heat and their power. Then he lifted the golden knife, placing the tip of the twin blades in the hollow of the captive's throat. "The people of Tivia thank you for your service," he said. The captive looked at him, all understanding absent from his glazed eyes. And then the prisoner pushed, and the white snow was stained with something hot and red.